Where do you see yourself in 5 years?
Right now, this is year one, pretty much, of the company that my partner and I established. So in 5 years, I see our company having grown a lot from where it is now. So employees and handling bigger projects and nonprofit work, which is something that we're starting right now. And we're really hoping to grow that as our company grows. So really just having a bigger kind of impact and having, more people in the office working with us and working for us.
What advice do you have for anyone that might be interested in a job as an architect?
The digital tools that we have in the profession now are really great, and they're really powerful in many ways to help people in the profession do more and produce more. But I don't think there ever really will be a replacement for hand drawing, for the ability to quickly sketch something out. Definitely don't abandon pen and paper, one of the most important design tools, as something that should always be used and always be part of the process. The digital tools that we have in the profession should be used to kind of supplement the hand tools. Like, they should be working together. You should be able to proficiently move back and forth between hand tools and digital tools.
Now, how do you feel about things like tablets where, they have the touch screen and the pen and you can kind of sketch on a tablet, or would you still prefer actual paper and a pencil?
I think tablets are great. They're definitely great to have in the field. Great to, like I mentioned, have, your drawing set on to take notes, take pictures. Although I don't do this, at least not yet, actually sketch on a tablet. I've heard from several people who do. I think they're like screen protectors that you can get, and you can get, like an Apple Pencil to make it feel more like you're actually writing on paper, drawing on paper. I think the technology is kind of catching up, and I think it's really compelling to me. I think that really could be a good tool to be able to kind of have a digital sketchbook. I think what's most important is your hand is guiding the process and not keys on a keyboard or a computer mouse.
Are there any things that people are surprised to learn about your job?
People think that architects do a lot of math and have to be really good at math and physics and stuff like that. And it certainly helps. You definitely need to have an understanding of how structures go together and basics, at least, of like an applied physics from that standpoint. I don't think I ever took a math class in college, in undergrad or grad school. We don't really do much math on a day-to-day. We work with engineers to do a lot of calculations and stuff like that, but it's more of a knowledge based on kind of experience. We're working with professionals to do a lot of that, the calculations and the technical stuff. A lot of people are surprised that architects typically don't do too much math.
Were there any specific classes in college or grad school that you enjoyed?
One class that I took in grad school that was really good, it was called Law for Architects, which might not seem very exciting. It was a law class taught by a lawyer.
I was going to say, offhand, that does not sound very exciting, but please elaborate.
No. It was the most probably helpful, important class that I took in college. Our professor had a sense of humor, and that helped certainly, but the content was something completely new. You don't learn much, or I didn't learn much about the business side of architecture in school, and this was probably the most practical, important information that I learned in any of my lecture classes in school was my Law for Architects class. Yeah, some of it was dry, but it was really good information to know. Some of my theory classes were definitely some of the more enjoyable ones. Architectural theory, there's a history of architects writing and speculating and creating manifestos about the way architecture should be or shouldn't be.
Are there any certifications or licenses that are useful to get as an architect?
Yeah, so beyond just becoming a licensed architect, there are quite a few certifications. LEED is one of them. LEED is one accreditation. It has to do with sustainability. Becoming less popular, and it's being kind of phased out by other certifications, like Passive House is one of the latest ones. You can become a Passive House consultant, and that's really a pretty rigorous, strict kind of building standard where your building is relying primarily on a lot of insulation, well kind of sealed airtight building, and like passive design strategies, meaning like getting heat from the sun as opposed to pumping conditioned air from a gas-fired furnace into the space. So Passive House is a big one, and you can become a Passive House consultant. And then there are a handful of other ones, and a lot of them have to do with sustainability.
Now, did other people in your degree program end up with a job similar to yours?
Many of them, yes, and others have gone on to do very different things, like work in the film industry or do more exhibition or like temporary exhibit design or a friend of mine from undergrad he's working on production for like music videos and marketing for fashion companies and things like that. Many people are kind of taking the traditional route, but I think with a background in architecture, it opens up a lot of possibilities to work in a whole bunch of other creative professions as well. I actually know some people who went on to work for Disney World as, I think they call it like Imagineers or something like that, where they're like designing rides and they're designing different parts of, the kind of Disney World experience.
Was there a strong possibility that you would have to relocate to find work in your field after you were done with school?
Generally, no. Right now, there's so much building happening, and there's such a demand for more construction that I think right now the answer to that's probably no. And also due to the fact that most people coming out of college are going to be in a city or in a town that has building and construction happening. So I would say there's a good chance you go to school for architecture that there are architecture jobs.
Do you ever have to do any traveling for your job?
My own business, we haven't really done much traveling. I have worked past jobs where we take projects in another part of the state or even another state, and yeah, there's some traveling. I think it's more likely working for a bigger firm that you'll be working on jobs that aren't local.
Do you mind telling us how much you make?
Right now, it's hard to say. We're 6 months into starting our own business. I can tell you, so like when I got out of grad school, me and most of my colleagues were going into jobs that were, making 50 to 60,000, and that's in our area. I think that's pretty competitive for the architecture profession at large. I will say architects probably don't make as much as a lot of people think they might.
Now, if you had to break your work day or your work week down into like a graph, what percentage of time would you spend doing certain things?
I probably spend 10% of my time at least prospecting, like looking for new projects. I probably spend another 10% just communicating, like emailing and phone calls, and maybe even more than 10% some weeks having meetings, phone calls, Zoom calls, a few in-person meetings. I probably spend another 10% working on kind of marketing things. 30 to 40% of my time is on a business administration kind of work, and 50 to 60% of my time, or 60 to 70%, is the kind of actual technical work of an architect. So drawing, design work.
And how would you split up the architect section of it? Of that, like 50 to 70% architect work, is 100% of it all designing in CAD, or is some of it going out to the field? Like, how would you break that down?
It really just depends what part of the design process our projects are in. I would say of the time I spend doing architecture work, usually at least half of that is design or documentation of some sort, whether that's drawing and sketching by hand or working in the computer, whether it's site visits. We'll meet with other consultants or local manufacturers or, other people that are involved in the process. That's sometimes part of it as well.
Now, was there anything that you did in college, high school, or grad school that you would recommend other people do?
I would say travel. In college I went to Europe. As an architecture student in particular, it's really incredible to see architecture that is, whether it's European architecture or, I traveled to Turkey, or, some of my colleagues have traveled to China or other parts of Asia. And it's so good to see other architecture around the world, whether it's historical or contemporary. But the way people build in different parts of the world can be very different than how we build here. And it's good to kind of broaden your perspective that way, to go and see architecture in other parts of the country or the world.
Now, just a quick question on that, like the whole study abroad thing, you usually have to pay for that, right? Like separate from like tuition and all that stuff, right?
It depends. Some programs have it more kind of built in. And yeah, you're usually going to pay travel costs kind of no matter what. But for me, it was sort of built in. I just paid tuition plus some travel costs, basically. So it was actually more affordable than going at it alone and doing like a self-funded trip.
If you just paid for it with tuition and everything, like what did you actually have to pay out of pocket? Was airfare, hotel, was that stuff included with the tuition or no?
I paid for airfare and some of my own like independent travel while I was over there. But I think most of the major costs were included. Like if I remember right, a lot of the lodging was included. A lot of the like transportation once we got there was included. A lot of the food was included. There's still definitely expenses, and airfare will be the biggest one. It also depends. Some places you can get scholarships. Like a lot of universities offer scholarships to go travel. So that can even offset it even more. for me, I probably spent a couple thousand, out of pocket, and that covered airfare and some of my own independent travel, plus some food and stuff that, you're going to pay. I was going to pay for anyway. Like what I found in Europe was food and meals weren't particularly more expensive than they are here.
Okay.
It was a pretty good value, and that's just going to depend, I think, from school to school, depending on what you're looking for, I think.
Yeah, no, that's cool because I've always thought like the travel abroad programs were just so great. I just want to know how, specifically yours, like broke down cost-wise, because I feel like some people, like myself, have this assumption that, yeah, travel abroad is great, but it's going to cost you 5 figures. But that's good to know that like that's not the case all the time. You can work a summer and like save that up if you want to do it. Now, was there anything you didn't do in college, high school, or grad school that you wish you had done if you had to go back and do it over again?
I mean, I would say the thing that I wouldn't do if I had to do it over again is kind of sacrifice so much of my own health and kind of well-being for my work, really. I think that the architecture studio, it can kind of really suck you in. You can just sacrifice so much of your own health just for your semester project. It's not really worth it. If I could change that, I would have. And I think I started to change that in grad school. It would be to kind of be more balanced in my approach and really prioritize my own health alongside of my schoolwork. Because ultimately, when you sacrifice your health and your personal goals and priorities outside of school, then I think that eventually it'll catch up to you. Your work that you're sacrificing so much for ends up suffering anyway.
Very cool. Yeah, no, I'm a big believer in that too. Like, take care of yourself health-wise first and foremost, because then the work's going to suffer anyway. Now, were there any classes, activities, or books that have made an impact on your professional life?
Yeah, there's probably a lot of books. I read pretty much every morning. I think reading in particular has definitely shaped my both academic and professional life. I think as an architect, it really pays to be very open-minded and kind of well-rounded intellectually. So to be able to branch out beyond the kind of narrow focus of the industry, I think is a huge asset.
There's no books or anything that specifically stick out, like, I'm glad I read this book, I got this out of it?
I went through a phase where I was reading quite a bit of science fiction, like H.P. Lovecraft and kind of older science fiction kind of books. And I ended up working on an architecture competition with a colleague, and we kind of used that as a foundation, this kind of science fiction background as kind of a foundation for this architecture project that ended up being a finalist in an international competition, reading H.P. Lovecraft and other books that have nothing to do with architecture. But on the other hand, they're really very descriptive books that create these really elaborate worlds. Use that and apply it to some of my work in the profession. Other books that, have nothing to do with architecture have been some of the more influential ones.
Do you have any other advice for kids that are unsure about what they want to do?
Yeah, I mean, I think architecture is really an incredible profession. There's an opportunity to kind of branch out and go and pursue all sorts of different creative opportunities, even after architecture school and all this stuff. The profession itself can be tough. It can be really challenging. Having something to kind of keep you going, something that you really value personally, that I think has helped me and has helped, some of my colleagues who can struggle in the profession and in school just because, like I said, it's tough and it's a lot of work. You have some reason to kind of keep going, even if you're unsure that you're on the right path. There's so many kind of different directions that you can take in education and architecture that you're not going to end up without options.